Okay, good evening everybody. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's a real pleasure to have been selected amidst my colleagues in Cambridge and Oxford as holder of this chair. It's a real honour. I have to confess something, which is that I feel a little bit substandard because I am not myself an Olympian. Okay? I have no particular sporting prowess, okay, but I do study political science, so hopefully I'll fit. Thank you to the foundation. Thank you particularly to Violette and Francesca for all their help in managing this chair. It's made it extremely smooth, and I'm very grateful to you. Thank you to my colleagues at the Institute and at the Department of Political Science at ULB. I have to say that ULB, and maybe particularly the Institute, is a place for which I have enormous affection. Long-standing research relationships with various colleagues. It's the place that I enjoy to come to, and it's been a real pleasure for me to spend the last month, spend some time at the Institute, and to get to spend some time with friends and colleagues. Thanks to my students, many of whom I can see here. Some of what I have to say will be slightly familiar based on some of the class discussions that we've had. Some of it will not, but hopefully it will reinforce your understanding of the topic of the course that we covered this semester. And thank you to everybody else who've come from outside, who've come here out of curiosity. Thanks also to some people who I know who are former students in Cambridge, who have now gone on to greater and better things. It's nice to see some familiar faces, and I hope that this will be an interesting lecture for you. Now, I've been told to try and keep it to 45 minutes. I have absolutely brutalized my talk to try and squeeze it into 45 minutes. I've really done my best. Okay. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions afterwards. Now, I'm a political scientist. I study politics in a very general sense. This is a talk about contemporary European history. Okay. So Europe since 1989. I'm going to try and introduce this idea which I've been working on for some time, which is this notion of the long 1989. Now, this is basically the idea that our starting point for this contemporary history of Europe, this Europe since 1989, should be understood as a metaphor. 1989 should be understood as a metaphor for a longer, more extended period of change, a decade of political, social, and economic transformation. And that decade runs from broadly the mid-1980s through until the mid-1990s. Now, the fall of communist regimes across Central and Eastern Europe, which Ramona alluded to briefly, is obviously a central part of this long 1989, a central part of this decade of change, but it's only one part of it. Perhaps the most visible part, but only just one part of it. So I suppose in a sense I'm trying to relativize the role of 1989 within this broader decade of change that I describe as the long 1989. So this long 1989 connects Western and Eastern Europe. It involves not just political liberalization, but also economic and social change. Now, what gives this decade a certain unity to it, in my view, is a process of unraveling of state, politics, and society which occurred during this decade. This unraveling refers to the end of ideological competition, but it also refers to the collapse of many of the political and social institutions that structured life in Europe and had structured life in Europe for, in some cases, over a century. Particularly those institutions associated with organized religion and organized labor. Now, I think in Europe today, we are still, in many respects, living in the shadow of this long 1989, and particularly in the shadow of its very ambivalent legacy. This unraveling of collective social bonds has in many respects been a liberating experience, okay? A positive experience, something that we should celebrate and be happy about or proud about. But at the same time, I think there are some negative features to this legacy. Okay? And I think our present circumstances, as some people characterize as a polycrisis, can be thought of as some of the negative features that have emerged out of this long 1989. So let me begin with a poem, okay, or a short excerpt of a poem. Okay. Now this is from a Polish poet, excuse my very poor pronunciation, Tadeusz Różewicz. He was a Polish poet. Okay? He was born in 1921 and died in 2014. So let me just read the excerpt. I'll read the English part, not the Polish part. So they do this and that and so on after the end of the former epoch and at the start of the new epoch. And not just artists. Something has ended, nothing wants to begin. Perhaps it has already begun. Now this poem has often been taken in various writings as emblematic of the Polish experience of transition. Right? The transition from the collapse of a communist regime into the more recent period that we know. I myself, I have to confess, have used it in that sense. And I recently discovered when I was preparing this presentation that actually this poem was published in 1962. It's not about the transition that I thought of at all. Okay? But those last three lines, I think in particular, are really quite good because they help us think about the difficulty of periodization, okay? Of when a historical era ends and a new historical era begins. Now, is 1989 really such a good cutoff? Does it denote an end and at the same time a beginning? As you can imagine, logically speaking, if you establish the beginning of a new era, you're also making the claim about the end of a previous era. Okay? So beginnings and endings are logically bound up with one another. Now, many people write about the post-Cold War era, which assumes in a way that we're still living in the shadow of the Cold War and its ending, something that went from the late 1940s through until the late 1980s. Some people write and speak about the post-wall era, which seems to me to really put quite a lot of emphasis on the fall of the Berlin Wall as the anchor for a new historical moment. Now, some people prefer to get rid of any sort of nuance and subtlety and just talk about the end of history, okay? Which is then problematic in more recent time, and so we talk about the return of history. Okay? Now, that sort of language seems to me to beg as many questions as it does provide answers, not least what the conception of history is exactly that we're talking about. Now, 1989, in a very obvious sense, is both an ending and a beginning. Okay? And to quote the Cambridge historian Jack Plum, historical change is not necessarily incremental. It can often come very quickly. In his words, as suddenly as water becomes ice. Now, let me tell you a story about what seems to me to capture the rocambolesque and very, very surprising quality of 1989 as a clear moment of historical rupture. Okay? This is a story about a man and his dog. Okay? As I'm telling the story, see if you can guess who the man and his, well, you don't know his dog, but if you can guess who the man is. Okay? The man and his dog, the year is 1987. So this man is walking his dog at around 9 o'clock in the evening. Okay? He's in the center of Prague, and he's walking close to the National Theatre by the river. And he realizes that something is going on. Okay? There's some sort of commotion. The commotion is outside the theatre, and he goes to investigate, and he sees that there's a small crowd that has been congregating outside the National Theatre. So he decides to explore. He notices that there's a line of long black cars outside of the National Theatre, and it's the kind of cars that you associate with high-ranking party members. Okay. So clearly something is going on. The man gets a bit closer. With the help of his dog, he manages to get to the front of the crowd. Okay, dogs always part crowds, partly out of fear, partly out of sort of affection. You get to the front. So he's at the front of the crowd. He realizes that somebody important must be at the theatre that evening. All the chauffeurs are waiting to take the officials away. Very soon afterwards, the doors open and people start to leave. The man sees a couple head for one of the cars, and he recognizes the man. It's the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, and he's with his wife, Raisha. Now, Gorbachev looks to the crowd, as is his custom, and the crowd calls out to him. Gorbachev looks directly at our man with the dog, who's at the front of the crowd, and smiles, and the man with the dog smiles back to him, and he even gives Gorbachev a little wave. Now, after all the cars have gone and after the crowd has dispersed, the man heads home. He's a small, pretty indistinguished figure, just padding along with his dog, walking back home through the dark streets of Prague. And he's thinking back to this moment with Gorbachev, and he's angry with himself, and he chides himself. Why did you smile? Why did you wave? Can anyone guess the man with the dog? Very good. Václav Havel. Now, this is a true story. Okay? Václav Havel is well known to most of you as a historical figure, the first president of a post-communist Czechoslovakia. Back when this story was happening, 1987, he was a dissident intellectual, okay, a playwright, well known, especially in the West, much less so in his own country. But in this story, he was also just a man and his dog walking around the city and happening to see this event taking place and waving to a very famous man. Just a few years later, Havel was negotiating with Gorbachev in the Kremlin about the withdrawal of Soviet troops from the territory of Czechoslovakia. What a remarkably swift and unexpected turnaround. Okay? This particular photo dates from the 10th of December 1989, and Havel is reading the list of the members of the first non-communist government in Czechoslovakia since 1948, okay, to the crowds in Wenceslas Square. Now, what this story indicates, and there are many other stories that I could have told, I had a long list of emblematic, paradigmatic stories for you. Okay? Some fictional, this one true. These stories communicate the speed and the unexpected quality of change in 1989. At the beginning of that year, you had authoritarian regimes across Central and Eastern Europe. Okay? Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, the German Democratic Republic, okay? Albania. By the end of the year, all of these regimes, with the exception of Albania, had fallen. Okay? Change came swiftly. The one exception here is Poland. Okay? Poland does stand out as a different case where change was more incremental, more uneven. Okay? Poland had its own revolution, if you want to call it that, back in 1980, 1981. This came with the emergence of Solidarność, the Union, and then martial law was imposed on the 13th of December, 1981. In a remarkable night where 5,000 arrests were made in just one night. Elsewhere, change was very swift. In Czechoslovakia, the regime collapsed in just a few weeks, in November and December. If we go back to the beginning of 1989, thinking in the context of Václav Havel, there are only about, and the number is difficult to calculate precisely, there are only about 500 dissidents in Czechoslovakia, okay, with a core of about 60. That was it. In the space of just a few weeks, you had repeated demonstrations. They began with around 10,000 people gathered in Wenceslas Square at the end of October. That then went to 100,000, 200,000. There was then a general strike of about 1 million people. At the end of December, the parliament, still full of communists, voted Havel in as the first, voted in a dissident intellectual as the new head of state. Now, in Romania, for example, change was even more condensed, even more quick, within the space of just a few days. On the 15th of December 1989, the regime targeted a Hungarian Protestant priest, Laszlo Tokes, who'd attracted a lot of attention for himself. He lived in a city, Timisoara, which is in the far west of Romania, and which I learned today is actually the European City of Culture for 2023. A day later, anti-regime protests broke out in that city after the priest had been targeted. The regime didn't manage to put them down. A few days later, on the 21st of December, Ceausescu came back from a trip to Iran and addressed the crowds in Bucharest. And he was heckled for the first time. And so he left. Right? He came back the next day, tried again. This time he was heckled and jeered. And that day, he fled from the roof of the party headquarters in a helicopter. 3 days later, he was tried and executed alongside his wife, Elena. So change comes, as Jack Plum said, as quickly as water turns to ice. But in many respects, 1989 doesn't work as this moment of quick rupture. The facts don't fit the narrative of this moment of quick and swift historical change. Albania was declared a multi-party state later, on the 12th of December in 1990. The Soviet Union, if you remember, collapsed at the end of 1991 with that famous speech by Gorbachev on television where he announced his resignation as president of the Soviet Union, which was a position that he himself had created. the hammer and sickle flag came down and the Russian tricolor flag went up. But this wasn't a conclusion to anything. The dissolution of the Soviet Union unleashed an enormous conflict between the presidency and the parliament, okay? Between Boris Yeltsin and the parliament, and it pushed Russia to the brink of civil war. Yeltsin wanted to impose upon Russia a very radical plan of economic transformation, of marketization and privatization. The parliament, its parliamentarians, didn't want this plan. Effectively, they didn't want it because of the social effects of privatization on the Russian population. In effect, in Russia, a market economy was acquired through military force. In October 1993, under Yeltsin's orders, the army shelled the parliament building, often known as the White House. Over 100 people died in this. This was known as Russia's Second October Revolution. Parliamentarians had barricaded themselves inside this building. Protesters outside were trying to protect them, and many of the people who died were the protesters outside this building. So now we're moving into the early 1990s. We're not in 1989 anymore. Okay? If we think about the republics of the Soviet Union, we find that already in 1987, 1988, societies were starting to mobilize. Okay? Popular fronts in the Baltic states were set up in 1988. The first of these was Edgar Savisaar, who made a remarkable declaration on Estonian television saying that they needed to set up a popular front. That was in April 1988. Looking at the histories of this period, there is a general consensus that the collapse of the Soviet Union was not inevitable at all. What really triggered it was the beginnings of perestroika and glasnost. It was the arrival of Gorbachev as General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party in March 1985. Gorbachev himself initially didn't want to pursue radical reforms. He wanted to do very much what one of his predecessors had done, Yuri Andropov, which was to try and make the Soviet Union work better according to its own rules. Now that failed. He was also prompted by other things that took place, not least the disaster in Chernobyl, which was in mid-1986, or in April 1986. Gorbachev then began to introduce his more radical reforms of perestroika and glasnost, and this gave the impetus for change in other parts of the Soviet bloc. If we add to the dissolution of the Soviet Union as a federal state, the war in Yugoslavia, and the collapse of another much smaller federal state, that takes us to the Dayton Peace Agreement of 1995. So here we have, certainly in the context of the Soviet Union and then Russia and Central and Eastern Europe, we have a broad period of change from 85 through to 95. Okay? 1989 really functions as a placeholder, as a metaphor for an extended period of change. And what was happening over this decade? This was a decade of unraveling, of collapse. We had the collapse of societies and political systems that were built around competing interpretations of modernity and history. Now, this was not simply the victory of the right over the left or of markets over central planning. Okay? It wasn't even at all the victory of the right over the left. I think what's much more appropriate to capture the sense of this decade is a phrase that comes from the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the common ruin of the contending classes, okay? Not the victory of one class over another. Now, what about in Western Europe? How well does this long 1989, this thesis of the long 1989 work for Western Europe? I think it works very well. Let me give you an example of Italy. Okay? Now, Italy had its political crisis in 1992, not 1989. But many people at the time, and subsequently in some writings, have compared actually Italy in 1992 with 1989, okay, the collapse of a regime. Now, 92 was a crisis of the Italian First Republic, certainly. It was a moment of real change. But once again, it didn't occur in a vacuum. Thinking about the Italian crisis of 92, it makes much more sense to think of it in a broader context of a crisis that covers about a decade long. The same long 1989 of 1985 to 1995. Okay. Now, the Italian First Republic, set up in 1946, was governed by the regime of the parties, the partitocrazia. Okay. And this reached its apogee in the 1980s with a coalition of 5 parties, which itself was crystallized into the rule of 3 individuals. Okay, this was known at the time as the CAF. Okay. So here we have the CAF. Okay, the CAF was the leader of the Socialist Party, Craxi. The A was Andreotti, one of the Christian democracy leaders, and the other Christian democracy leader was Forlani. Okay, and that gives us the CAF. Here you have the 3 men here. Craxi's in the middle, very tall, sort of pretty lumbering big guy. Andreotti much smaller. Okay. Now, the crisis of 1992 in Italy was the crisis of a certain kind of model that united politics and society together. Okay. It wasn't just a crisis of the parties. There's a scene in the film by Paolo Sorrentino, if anybody's seen this, called Il Divo, which is a great film from 2008. Il Divo is about Andreotti, okay, the political figure of Giulio Andreotti. And there's a scene in that film where Andreotti is receiving a long line of visitors. They're all lining up, and he's giving each of his visitors these presents. Okay? One after the other, he gives them presents. Okay? It's a remarkable scene. Now, on the one hand, this appears a most brazen example of Italian clientelism, okay? Just giving presents. Okay? But on the other hand, it shows how intimately structured society and politics were under the Italian First Republic. So on top of that, you then have the voice of organized labor, the Italian Communist Party, which was generally in opposition during this period, but decision-making for governments, economic decision-making, was intimately done in association with, in cooperation with, in negotiation with the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, as the voice of organized labor. And the PCI itself was a social institution. Right? It structured the workplace, it structured people's social habits, it determined to some extent their social circles. Now, the Italian crisis of 1992 is well known. Okay, I won't go through it in too much detail. The April 1992 elections, you still had some figures from the old regime. Craxi and Forlani were still there. Okay. The PCI had already adapted itself slowly, had changed its name. It was no longer the Italian Communist Party. It was now the Democratic Party of the Left. In the 92 election, the Northern League broke through, so change was beginning. But what really prompted the collapse was the political corruption scandal, Tangentopoli. This affected the top-ranking politicians. Somebody like Craxi was eventually hauled in front of the judges to testify at the end of 1993. In May 1994, Craxi decided he'd had enough. He didn't want to go to jail, and he fled to Tunisia. Now, in addition to this, you had another set of events that affected Italy, and this was the crisis of the Italian state. Here we have 2 of the most prominent anti-mafia judges at the time. On the one side, the man with the glasses, who's Falcone, Giovanni Falcone, and his friend and colleague Paolo Borsellino. Both of those were killed within just a few months of each other by car bombs in Sicily. Now, what's remarkable about the March 1994 elections is absolutely remarkable. All the mainstream parties of the Pentapartito, the coalition, the CAF, they'd all gone. The political elite had completely disappeared. Okay? The 1994 election in Italy recorded the highest level of electoral volatility in any election in Western Europe since 1885. Okay? The First Republic political elites had simply vanished. So this really is what I'm talking about when I say the common ruin of the contending classes. Okay? But we tend, when we think about these political crises, to focus on the year, the months, okay, the days when it happens. But there is always a broader context for this. And in the case of the collapse of the Italian Republic, which was a key moment in the beginning of the 1990s in Europe, the origins of that, I think, take us back at least to 1985. 1985 was a really important year because it was a year of the referendum on the Italian wage indexation system, the Scala Mobile. Now, I understand that Belgium has a sort of wage indexation system, okay? Well, in Italy, the Scala Mobile was the most extensive protection for workers' wages that existed anywhere in Europe. Okay? Essentially, it provided workers with an almost immediate protection against price rises. Okay? The adaptation to prices was done very regularly on salaries. Now, cutting the Scala Mobile became the focus of Craxi's government in the early 1980s. And that put him at loggerheads with this man here, Berlinguer, the head of the PCI. Breaking with tradition, the tradition being to consult and cooperate with the opposition, which is the Italian Communist Party. Breaking with tradition, Craxi decided to push through the reform of the Scala Mobile by decree. Berlinguer responded by managing to organize a referendum on this decree, and the PCI supported the rejection of the decree, and Craxi obviously argued for supporting this decree. Now, this referendum ended up being about much more than just the Scala Mobile. This was a political crisis in many respects. This was really a moment of change in Italian politics and society. First of all, the union movement, organized labor, was split. Some of the unions were in support of reforming Scala Mobile. Some of them supported the Communist Party in arguing against the reform of Scala Mobile. This was also really a referendum on the ability of the government in Italy to autonomously make decisions about economic policy, not consulting in a direct way, liaising with the unions and with the Communist Party. So this is really a referendum on the state-society model that existed in Italy and had become established and sedimented in the post-war period as part of the fundamentals of the First Republic. The result was pretty clear. It was a victory for Craxi. 54.3% voted against repealing the decree, 46.7% voted in favor. So this referendum was the beginning of the growing enfranchisement of the Italian state and the parties from Italian society and social groups in Italy. It liberated the parties from their social base. That made it easier to pursue economic reforms, but it also made them vulnerable and paved the way to the collapse of the party system in the early 1990s. Now, I think this story about Italy echoes quite well with some of what was going on in other parts of Europe at the same time, okay? In other parts of Western Europe in particular. Even the timing is very, very similar. Okay? At the same time as you had the Scala Mobile referendum in Italy, you had the miners' strike in the United Kingdom. The miners' strike was a crucially important moment in British labour history because, as with the Scala Mobile referendum, the British union movement was split. And many of the unions didn't support, in fact, the National Union of Mine Workers who were on strike. This was also a time where France, under a socialist president, François Mitterrand, had decided to pursue what was known as a policy of rigueur. Mitterrand decided already in March 1983 that he was going to keep France within the exchange rate mechanism, and then started to roll out policies that were extremely different from the ones that he'd been elected on in 1981. So the long 1989 is pivotal as a transformation in European party systems and in political economy. Something that it is as well is a decade of de-industrialization. This is one of the dominant features of the long 1989, is this protracted period of de-industrialization. Now, some of the economic changes were pushed through via the Single European Act of 1985, the Maastricht Treaty of 1992. All of this is reasonably well known in establishing the single market as the basis for a recast European economy in the 90s. But what I was struck by was the extent to which the long 1989 coincides with some of the most iconic, some of the most paradigmatic instances of de-industrialization. Let me give you one example. This is the Renault factory, known as the Usine Billancourt, which is on the river in the west of Paris on the Ile Séguin. Now, this was a factory that was first set up by Renault in 1929. Okay? It is an absolutely enormous industrial site. Okay? The scale of this Usine Billancourt is actually difficult for us to comprehend. Okay? It was the place where Fordist methods were imported from the United States as a basis for more rapid manufacturing. This was one of the biggest car factories in the world. It covered 100 hectares, and at its peak it employed 40,000 workers. You had a car that rolled off the production lines every minute and a half, okay, in the Usine Billancourt. This factory was closed in 1992. It stood empty for about a decade. In 2005, all the buildings were demolished. Part of it, one end of it, which is this end here, has become a sort of cultural hub of a kind, and the rest of it remains fairly desolate. Something that I noticed in doing some research on this is that the current head of the CGT, though this is going to change in the next couple of days, but who has been the leader of the CGT for some time, Philippe Martinez, he was he started working in the usine Billancourt in 1982. Now, thinking about somebody like Martinez, who's one of the most public faces in the protests in France around the reform of the pension system, his dominant experience as a unionist has not been French industry. Okay? It's not been the usine Billancourt churning out cars every minute and a half. It's been a period of French de-industrialization. That's what shaped his outlook and his worldview. And that's the product of the long 1989. Now, 1989 is not just about the collapse of the long 1989 rather, it's not just about the collapse of communist regimes. It's not just about the collapse of these fossilized Cold War era party systems. Okay? And it's not just the collapse of European industries. It's also, and I think this is really important, a decade of social change and the erosion of long-standing and very powerful social institutions. Let me bring in Ireland. Okay? Let's take the example of Ireland. Ireland in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Now, if we go back to 1979, there was a visit by the Pope, John Paul II, to Ireland in 1979, which attracted, in some of the public talks that he gave, there were 1 million people who were there. Okay? An extremely popular and successful visit by the Pope. In 1983, the prohibition of abortion in Ireland was inscribed into the constitution after a referendum. In 1986, there was an attempt by the government to remove the constitutional ban on divorce, which was heavily defeated. So by the end of the decade, the authority of the church is enormous. And the authority of the church was particularly prominent in people's private lives, their intimate life, their life as a couple, or their life as a single man or a woman, and especially in family matters, matters of family planning. Okay? Now I want to give you just an example to illustrate this, and I'm trying to illustrate here a sense of contrast, okay? But also a period that's actually fairly recent. Okay? In his memoirs, the journalist Fintan O'Toole has a very funny episode that he recounts. This is an episode that took place in 1985. Okay? Fintan O'Toole was 27 at the time, and he needed a lift from Maynooth, which is a university town. He needed a lift from Maynooth to Dublin. Now, he found himself in a Lancia sports car, okay, with a driver that he described as a stocky, moon-faced, bald man in a black clerical garb with a gold pectoral cross hanging from his neck. Okay? So who was this individual driving this Lancia sports car? Of course, it was an Irish bishop. Okay? This man here, Eamon Casey. Now, Eamon Casey was a very prominent and very well-regarded Irish bishop. Okay? Very, very well known for lots of different reasons, which I won't go into. The description of his experience in O'Toole's memoirs, what struck him most is that he drove like a complete maniac. Okay? He was doing over 120 miles an hour. Cars coming in the opposite direction were no obstacle for Casey's determination to overtake the lorries on the Dublin road. By the time O'Toole got to his destination, and he did arrive alive, he could barely walk because his legs were shaking so much. Now, what's interesting is that he reflects on this experience, and he says, and his reflection about Casey is this. He says, this man likes to take risks. Okay? Part of the reason for doing so, according to O'Toole, is that Casey was just enormously arrogant, but there was also a sense of entitlement so ingrained that he was no longer conscious of it. Casey thought that he was too important to follow the rules. Now, this, I think, is a nice anecdote that illustrates the extent to which the church exercised enormous authority and power at the time. There are some other stories about Casey that O'Toole recounts, which are even more flowery and extreme. Okay? Now, just a few years later, everything changed for Casey. In May 1992, it was revealed that Bishop Casey had fathered a child with a divorced American woman, and that he'd been using church funds to raise and support this child. Now, this began a decade of endless scandals for the church, usually to do with sexual offences committed by priests. And as a result, the church's hold on people's morality and behaviour weakened immeasurably. Okay. Now, just to give you a few figures, the Irish church as an institution, in the 1960s, every year about 1,400 people took up religious vocations in Ireland. Okay, it's not a huge population, so 1,400 is quite a lot. In 2009, 9 priests were ordained and 160 died. In the same year, 2 nuns took their vows and 228 died. So Ireland's religious establishment has literally been dying out. Okay? And Irish society has now become remarkably progressive. Now we know Ireland is a pioneer in lots of legislation to do with LGBT rights. The transformation is really enormous. Okay? And this is what I mean about the collapse in collective authorities and collective social institutions. Okay? Now the same story about the decline of the authority of the church and its decline and disappearance as an institution could be told about a number of other European countries. So now let me move on to thinking about the legacy of the long 1989. Now what is replacing the long 1989? What comes after the long 1989? To be honest, this is quite difficult to say. I like to quote the French documentarist Ovidie, who describes the generation that came of age in the 1990s as the generation without a name. Too young to be part of the baby boomer generation. Too old just to be millennials. Okay? And nothing like generations that come afterwards, X, Y, or Z. Okay? Now she means this quite critically. A generation without a name for her is some sort of cognitive failing. We can't understand this generation. Okay? But I think it's actually quite a good description. It's a generation without a name because there's nothing definitive in a historical or temporal sense that happened to which it could be given a name. Right? So it describes, I think, this generation very well. What follows, I think, from the long 1989 is a different sort of politics, one that's much less structured around mass parties and social groups. Now, this kind of politics has 2 dimensions to it. One is a strong international orientation. Politics in this period, after my long 1989, so from the mid-90s onwards, politics became defined simply as international politics. Okay? The first Iraq War, the humanitarian effort in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, NATO's bombing campaign in 1999. The most heated political debates were about humanitarianism and humanitarian intervention versus state sovereignty, not capitalism versus socialism. This was also a period which was the high mark for anti-capitalist and anti-globalization protest. Okay? Think about the anti-globalization protest that shook Genoa in 2001. Think about the famous Battle for Seattle of 1999. Okay? This was also the time of L'Auberge Espagnole, okay? Another film that you may have seen, a film about a rather uptight French student who then came of age by spending his Erasmus year in Spain. The possibility of movement within Europe became fairly firmly entrenched into people's habits and expectations at this time. And it gave their outlook a very strong European dimension, and it made national politics appear very old, very parochial, very old-fashioned. Now, the second dimension is the rise of what I call anti-political sentiment. Now, we tend to associate this with the populist wave of post-2008 that washed across Europe. Okay? In actual fact, it develops much earlier than that. The point about anti-political sentiment, I think, is that the target of social discontent is not on ideological or class enemies. Okay? The target of social discontent is on public institutions at large, from the judiciary to the party system to the police. Now, there are lots of examples that I could have given, but one that really struck me, because I think it was quite an important one and a very early one, is this event, which took place in Brussels on the 20th of October 1996, the Meersch Blanche. Now, the tragic circumstances for this are ones that people probably know about, which was the abuse and the murder of children by Marc Dutroux and his associates. This became a matter of public anger because of the errors in the judicial system and the egregious errors in the police investigation as well. Now, though it's unique in its origins and uniquely tragic in its origins, I think the Meersch Blanche was emblematic of a new sort of politics emerging in Europe at the time, emerging out of the long 1989. The march had no connection to any of the principal social and political cleavages that have marked Belgium since 1830. Okay? Nothing to do with the clash between different linguistic communities, nothing to do with the clash between the Catholics and the libre penseurs, between social classes. And the focus of the anger was on the country's public institutions. This was a conflict between ordinary citizens and the state. The final element of the white march of La Marche Blanche, which is, I think, really important in helping us understand something about contemporary politics, is that it was marked by a paradoxical combination of quasi-revolutionary anger and the absence for any sort of long-term institutionalization. So the Marche Blanche was at the same time insurrectionary and ephemeral. The Belgian Prime Minister at the time, Jean-Luc Dehaene, commented, looking back, he said that had the parents of the assassinated children called for violence, then everybody would have followed. The atmosphere between the arrest of Dutroux and the October March was, as he described it, pre-revolutionary. But a year later, there was nothing left. Okay? All the committees that had been set up at the local level had all disappeared. All the reforms that had been recommended had just been left to the bureaucratic apparatus to manage. And the key reform that was recommended, particularly by the parents, was the fusion of the local and the national police force, and that kicked around the bureaucratic apparatus for years until it was finally achieved. Now, this combination of the insurrectionary and the ephemeral, I think, captures politics in the aftermath of the long 1989 quite well. And there are lots of examples that we can give. Think of Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands, his rapid emergence, his assassination, his success electorally, and then the quick demise of his electoral force. Okay? Think about the earthquake in France in 2001, something that melted away very quickly. Think about the referendum votes in 2005 on the EU constitution. Those who were in France at the time remember how everyone was talking about this, arguing about it. Families were divided about it. 6 months later, nobody was talking about it at all. This combination of the insurrectionary and the ephemeral also makes me think about some of the more recent protests that we've seen in Europe. What's striking, I would say, about the Marche Blanche is that it was completely pre-digital. Okay? We often associate this absence of institutionalization of political movements with social media and new technologies. Okay, October 1996, this was an analog event. This had nothing to do with social media or new technology. Okay, so let me begin to wrap up. Okay, I'm not quite sure how long I've been talking, but I'm going to wrap up. Okay, let me say a word about freedom. Okay, freedom and the long 1989. Seems to me that the way in which we understand freedom today and some of the difficulties we have in our experience of freedom are connected to the legacy of the long 1989. In doing research for my book, I've been reading quite a lot, and I was struck by something that I found in Ralph Dahrendorf's 1990 book, okay? Reflections on the Revolution in Europe. This was a book that Ralph Dahrendorf, who was a German a sociologist and political figure and ended up in Oxford as the warden of St. Anthony's College, he wrote a book, Reflections, and it was in the form of a letter to a Polish friend, somebody that he'd had a long conversation with, and now he was responding to his Polish friend in a letter form. Okay. And Dahrendorf takes up a concern that his Polish friend had about 1989 and about the political changes taking place in Poland, okay? The collapse of the communist regime change. And his Polish friend, was really concerned about the arrival of a new style of life, a cultural change, okay? And his fear is that this was going to usher in, okay, a style of life that was more hedonistic, okay, more materialistic, more consumerist, more individualistic than anything that existed before. And he was afraid of a collapse in the general cultural level of society. Dahrendorf's response to his Polish friend is interesting. Okay? He says, this is a quote, "I wish you well. I wish you well in your attempt to stem the tide of trash and glitter, but I suspect that it will sweep you away." Now, what's interesting about what Dahrendorf says is he doesn't contest the idea from his Polish friend that culture in capitalist societies is predominantly a matter of trash and glitter. He just says that you won't have any choice and you're going to have to embrace it. Okay? Now, Dahrendorf was certainly right that there was no choice about the matter. If we look at the elections in East Germany, in the GDR, there were hastily arranged elections in March 1990. The pro-reunification party, the CDU, picked up an enormous number of votes, 48%. The SPD, the Social Democrats, were a bit cautious about reunification, and they won 22%. The dissident intellectuals, who had campaigned heavily for a more humane, more democratic, but still socialist and still independent GDR, got 2.8% of the vote. Now, this is a theme that's taken up by the French writer Annie Ernaux in her book Les Années. Now, she describes her experience of 1989 in that book, okay, which echoes some of the themes that Dahrendorf evokes in his own book. So she was initially envious of the East's political revolutions. Okay? So much is going on, it's so exciting. But in the book, she describes how she eventually gets, and quite quickly, she begins to feel pity for the Easterners. These are her words. Especially, she says, the GDR citizens with their, quote, awful clothes and bags full of bananas. She says there was something touching about their enthusiasm for the art and the act of consumption, but also something very irritating about it. In her words, quote, they did not seem to be up to the standard of liberty, pure and abstract, that we had built for them. And she says, we felt as if they were misappropriating their newfound liberties. And then she says, we liked them more when they were queuing up for salami and books, deprived of everything, as this allowed us to savor what it meant to belong to the free world. Now, I've thought quite a lot about the sentiments that Ernaux was trying to evoke here, okay, looking back and thinking back to her own experience. Why did Ernaux and those around her resent the consumption of the Easterners, the Aussies, so much? Okay? Why were they so disappointed when they all rushed into West Berlin to visit the sweet shops, the fruit stores, and, of course, the sex shops? Now, one of the reasons is that some of these shops, such as Beate Uhse's shops, were giving away glossy magazines. Okay? According to the historian Mary-Elise Serot, Uhse, who was the business brain behind these sex shops, gained around 2 million new customers after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But why was Ernaux so annoyed? Why was she so disappointed? Okay? Now, one reason for the disappointment, I suppose, is that the people that they had thought of, Ernaux and others, as the noble victims of totalitarian terror were just appearing as normal people with normal desires, normal wishes, very ordinary. Okay? But there's a deeper reason, and the deeper reason, I think, is that they revealed to her, okay, they revealed to her the content, the meaning, and the limits of our own freedom. Okay? Living in the free world of the West was not as grand or as noble as the Westerners had believed it to be. It was actually a freedom that could be distilled down into the availability of goods in the shops. So what Ernaux is saying is that by revealing to us Westerners the materialism of our own lives, these new and frenetic consumers left us feeling disappointed, but more than anything else left us feeling a little bit ashamed as well. In fact, compared to the demonstrations, the street battles, compared to the holding of hands across hundreds and hundreds of kilometers that mark this famous Baltic Way celebration of 1989, compared to the attempts to convince tank drivers to ignore orders or soldiers not to shoot, there was something rather tawdry and cheap about what the West could offer. So I think, seen in this way then, the story of freedom emerging out of the long 1989 is at the very least an ambivalent one. Okay? There's unquestionably cause for celebration. As I was telling you, the expansion of individual rights that in some cases means pushing out organized religion, appropriating one's own private life and enfranchising oneself from the church. There's many things to celebrate. But the individualization comes at a cost. And that cost is to lose sight of collective causes and the freedom that can come from embracing and not running away from collective identities. Let me end just with a picture. This is the Baltic Way, organized in 1989. I interviewed quite a lot of people who were involved in organizing the Baltic Way a year or so ago, and I was struck by the extent to which many of them still relive this as the definitive experience of their lives, and in some ways almost miss the sense of being part of history, in spite of everything that's happened since then. Let me just end with a quote from a memoir, which I recommend to all of you, by Leah Ipi, which is called Free. Okay? And there's a quote at the end of this book which is absolutely remarkable. Leah Ipi was born in Albania and grew up in Albania, is now a professor at the London School of Economics. And her book is about growing up in Albania in the 1980s and her experience of the collapse of the regime. But there's a phrase at the end of her book where she says, "My world So my world today, my world living in London with my family as a professor at the LSE, my world as a woman living in the United Kingdom, in Western Europe, my world is as far from freedom as the world my parents tried to escape. Now, we may not agree exactly with what she says, but what she expresses, I think, is that maybe the most important legacy of Europe's long 1989 has been a disenchantment with both socialist and liberal conceptions of freedom. And so the task, I think, today, if we are looking for a task, and we may not be looking for a task, but if we are, then I think it's to trace the contours of a conception of freedom that is fit for the present day. Thank you very much.